Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here on a Saturday morning. You know, thinking back to sort of Climate Week and all the events of this week, it's really clear that across the financial services industry, environmental, social, governance issues have become an integral part of the landscape. In fact, I think we caught the tail end of the last panel where the discussion had already started. So, given how keen global policymakers are to channel private sector funding to address climate and ESG risks, how are leading financial firms incorporating sustainability into their business strategies? You know, we have a lot of sustainability working groups. There are public sector coalitions like the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System. It really seems that there ought to be a peer group for the hardworking C-suite executives who have to take all these green initiatives down from 64,000 feet into practice. So our reason for putting together this particular set of panelists is that they're all at the forefront of greening our industry. Or as Japan's environment minister put it this week, they're making the fight against climate change sexy. Green is clearly the new black. So, Michelle, maybe you can start with a little bit of scene setting here. So what does ESG mean from your perspective at the head of Zurich Insurance?
Well, quite a lot. I think that there is a piece in the insurance industry which is almost innate connected to sustainability and ESG. We know the price of some decision taken or some decision not taken. In that respect, I feel that the alignment between, if I may say, the main preoccupation of the current generation and the mission statement of the insurance is quite perfect. It is, I think, one of the also dimension and challenges in which we need to be global, and I know that globalization is something which is sometimes criticized, or there is quite a lot of tension about the value of globalization. I do believe that if there is something which should be done in matters of addressing these challenges, that's the global aspect of them. The millennial generation is absolutely clear about that. Let's be fair, I belong to a generation in which the first consciousness came probably through my children, but this generation is now part of our employees and each time more part of our investors. So that's also an important pressure. But again, for the insurance industry, climate, and I may remember that I've been a reinsurer for which it is even more important. We know the price of not doing the things that we should do. The other dimension, when we speak about ESG, E, that's clearly the green, but we have also the S and G. And for me, these are also extremely important. We need to combine what we want to do in order to improve the situation from a climate standpoint, to also include the social dimension and the governance dimension. If I may speak about the social dimension very shortly, I do believe that you see that that there is each time more, it's probably more in the West, but generally part of the population who do not feel definitively that they are part of what is happening, and that's probably also moving a little bit their priorities from precisely environment. So I think it's extremely important that we also take care of that as insurer, and we can do that. Governance is also extremely important when we speak about data. What do we do with their data? And that's also an element in which I do believe they expect from us a certain discipline. So if I may conclude, I do believe that one of the key elements is definitively protecting the planet. There is no real point in only protecting the planet if you don't protect the society. So this combination is probably one of the key challenge.
It's an important point, you know, that the policy backdrop is evolving very rapidly, especially in Europe, of course. And so maybe, Kees, you could give us a little bit of your perspective. You know, the polling question asked what was important, and engagement with regulators and policymakers is seen as important. What does the industry need from its regulators? And how about that EU Sustainable Action Plan that they're going to export around the world now? How is that going in direction-wise?
Yeah, I think this is a very important element in Europe. We see a clear development in that direction in certain countries. The Netherlands has a Dutch regulator which is very much involved actually in the sustainability area. They come from a risk perspective. That's the way they talk about it. And I would say we as banks, ABN AMRO as an example, we have also 2 years ago more or less said our bank we want to bank for better for generations to come, and then the sustainability pillar is one of the 3 crucial pillars actually in our new strategy. But we also see it not so much from I would say, a risk perspective. That's true. We think that the companies that are at the forefront of this development will also be the better companies going forward. That's our expectation. But we also clearly see it as a business model. And what was just on the screen, a lot needs to be done. So the taxonomy was mentioned. And I would say that's important because if not everybody, we make our integrated reports, we do our impact studies and what have you. But everybody is now a bit struggling with the KPIs and with the exact data collection and what to show. And you don't want to go into the greenwashing, so you have to be very careful. You don't want to be accused of that. So I would say it's also very much in that area where, like, take for instance the IFRS development we've seen in the financial sector. We need, and that should be on a global scale in the end, we need to develop more these taxonomies and also I would say regulators. Although there are different perspectives, I just spoke with one of my people who was at a forum, I think it was yesterday, a lunch meeting. And there was a discussion between our Dutch regulator, but also the SEC, about the topic of sustainability. And their division of the SEC was, well, this is something which should be in the private domain, not a regulator should do a thing like that. So it is still up for debate, I would say. In the Netherlands, no longer, but yeah, it's early days, I would say. But it's important. I think that regulators stress it as well. But in the end, I would say, and I agree in that sense actually also with the SEC, the institutions themselves have to do it. And you do it for your clients, and to your point, also for your employees. In our employee engagement, we noticed when we asked, do you want to work for a sustainable bank? You don't want to be a bumper sticker. We want to work for a sustainable bank. 92% of my staff says yes. So that's why people come, that's why people stay. It's not only for the money anymore. People also want to have a, purpose-led organization.
Yeah. You raise a really interesting point. For anybody who didn't get a chance to see yesterday's debate on stage between the chair of the NGFS, Frank Elderson, and the US SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce, really worth watching. Set out the very different perspectives here in the US and in Europe on how a framework should evolve, or not, if you're a US perspective. But Johan, there's a lot of stakeholders here, right? And the United Nations has played a big role, I think in part because the regulatory and policy response has been slow to evolve. So the UN sort of stepped in, not least with those principles for responsible banking. So you guys were early signatories of the PRB, and how do you see their role?
No, I think undoubtedly you will become much more powerful if we do it together. Every bank is doing their own thing right now, and we need these common initiatives to work as a catalyst to just find common standards. And this is probably the biggest one happening right now in the regime of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement and the UN to get, was it 131 banks to sign up to this Sunday 3 weeks ago in the UN, kicking off Climate Week. And it's a taxonomy, and it's going to be finding common standards. What I found very interesting coming from a Northern European country is when we did the panel debate in the UN, and they were asking Asian, Latin American, and African banks, what will you now do different after signing? There was not a climate thing on their agenda. It was actually more basic, such as getting employment, deal with youth unemployment. And one of the CEOs pointed to certain countries and areas where 60% of the population is still unbanked. I mean, they don't even have the luxury to think about what we are predominantly focusing on in Europe. It is to really take that next step and expanding the green into something much, much broader. So I think there's a lot of challenges just to have regional harmonization on what is actually important, what's the weakest link here and now, and we will all have to help.
Yeah, the perspectives of emerging markets really are an important part of the considerations of the NGFS as well, right? Because they have a number of members, central banks and supervisors from emerging markets, because it's a whole different picture for them. So, Audrey, let me turn to you here. You know, firms like Morgan Stanley that have a big global wealth management business have seen huge changes in recent years, right? A lot more demand, need to innovate new products, and you know, maybe a different understanding of the link between ESG and financial performance. Can you do well by doing good? And maybe even fiduciary duty. So, so what are your perceptions here?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, we've seen a tremendous, really exponential growth in this field over the last number of years. You know, at Morgan Stanley, we focused on this quite early on from a mainstream banking perspective. It was actually about 11 years ago that we founded the Global Sustainable Finance Group at Morgan Stanley, specifically to figure out where were the most important intersections between the world of capital markets and investing with sustainability and impact. You know, but 10 years ago when we started that, it was still sort of considered kind of a niche market, especially for a mainstream capital perspective. It was, you know, maybe $1 out of $11 in the United States had some sort of sustainability mandate. It might have just been, you know, avoiding certain stocks that people didn't want to own from a religious or values-based perspective. Fast forward, it is now globally $1 out of every $3 into professional management. So $30 trillion has some sort of E, S, or G mandate to it. In the United States, it's about $12 to $13 trillion. I think there's a couple of things that have happened that have really contributed to that. One is, frankly, the increased transparency. Right, so in this room, we probably have sitting in all of your pockets 150 supercomputers with which you can figure out what you own, what those companies own, what those companies are doing, and potentially, you know, if you wanted to, potentially what the impact of those things are on the world. And we're seeing that increasingly investors who are very focused on issues like climate change, like social issues, understand that it's not just about their volunteer dollars or their volunteer hours or their political action, it's also about their investment as to how are they contributing to these factors. So I think that transparency has contributed to the desire of more investors to do it. But for a long time, I think there's always been the hesitation that even if you want to do it, are you really prepared as a fiduciary or as someone who's just interested in how your portfolio does, are you really prepared to potentially have the assumed discount if you think about, you know, environmental issues or social issues as part of your investment? And one of the things that we've focused on a lot, as have other academics and other centers, you know, we founded about 7 years ago an Institute for Sustainable Investing, where one of our key mandates is really to do analysis and to understand what is going on. And what we've seen is that increasingly there's real evidence that not only does the environment and social considerations, not only do they not create a discount to your returns, but they can actually enhance the performance of your portfolio. We just released a study where we looked at 10,000 funds over 8 years of performance, comparing the sustainable to the traditional, and we found that actually there was no difference in performance. However, the sustainable strategies had a lower volatility, and they also had about 20% smaller downside. So I haven't yet met any investor or trader who said, I don't want the investment that will give me about the same return with less risk and less downside. So I think with that, we're seeing a real, you know, a continued acceleration of money into it. And I think that, you know, that's helping also answer the fiduciary question, right? Which is, as a fiduciary, it's not trading financial responsibility for environmental. It's saying, well, if you're running a business, how could you not want to understand the potential material risk from an insurance perspective, from a business continuity perspective, that climate change, extreme weather can have? The last, I think, fun data that I'll share with you, because I think it also goes right to the core of, do social issues, you know, to the issues you were raising, do they pay? Are they a discount? We actually did an extensive analysis of gender diversity and performance. And we found that the high gender diversity companies actually outperformed their industry benchmark by 1.7%. percentage points, and that the low diversity ones actually underperformed benchmark about 1.4% per year. So you're talking about a 3.1 percentage point gap between the high diversity companies and the low diversity companies compared to benchmark. And so I think we're really starting to see more and more evidence that those diverse workforces, businesses that think about not just their shareholders, but also their extended kind of stakeholders are actually doing the right thing for shareholders at the end of the day also.
Well, you remember we mentioned the tweeting. I think we just heard at least two things there that are worthy, and I expect to see those. Where's Mike? On the Bloomberg screens imminently. But Doug, let me bring you in here. Audrey mentioned sort of disclosure, more transparency, and so on. A lot of talk about maybe even moving to mandatory disclosure on climate-related risks. But how do you look at it, and maybe should we be thinking more about kind of market-based standards?
Well, when we look at this panel, 5 years ago, we probably would not have had this panel unless maybe we were doing this conference in Copenhagen or Stockholm. So if you go back 5 years ago, this was a very large theme in Scandinavia, Northern Europe. It spread into Canada, Japan, Singapore, Australia, and now finally this wave has come to the United States. I would describe it for baseball fans as we're still in the second inning, though. We're at the very beginning of this, and so the point about disclosure is an important one, and it came up on this little poll we just did. Taxonomy, disclosure type themes were the largest issue that popped up with this audience. So right now there are many different initiatives going on around the world. You've got the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, A4S, Accounting for Sustainability, the banking initiatives we've heard about. And it's critical that organizations like IIF start acting as a clearinghouse and as a broker to bring those together. There are today 36 different private sector raters, including ourselves. S&P Global has a couple of different products and services where we're providing ratings, ESG taxonomy, climate-related taxonomy, climate-related information through TrueCost. But of those 36, those are the ones that are doing some sort of an official ESG evaluation, rating, surveying, et cetera. In addition to that, there's another almost 100 of other organizations that are doing some slice of E, S, or G, like Working Mothers Magazine that does a survey to see which companies are the best for women to work at those organizations. But let's go back for a second to what are the different aspects to this. We need to engage with the securities regulators, with the accounting industry, as well as the financial industry to start thinking about what are those 36 different organizations doing, how do we think about SASB, et cetera, to start honing in on standards. There are certain standards which the market is starting to pick up more clearly, and most everything that we use today at S&P Global for our evaluations is self-disclosed. And so the question about moving towards some kind of required disclosure or standards around disclosure, we're heading there, but the more that we can first of all get the private sector to think about what are those standards, the better.
Yeah, I think our discussions in our sustainable finance groups would certainly concur with that view. Let me just slip in one of these audience questions here because it's directly relevant to what we've been discussing now. And maybe, Doug, you can start. I don't know. It's about the kind of role of the U.S. in all of this. You know, what can we do, or how can we encourage U.S. policymakers to take this seriously? I think
well, first of all, the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, which looking for leadership from the public sector right now is not going to be very easy. The SEC has a view that the type of ESG standards that should be set by the private sector, and that it should become more of a disclosure approach as opposed to a standards approach from the SEC. So this is really putting the opportunity, I'm not going to call it a burden, an opportunity back on the private sector to take the lead on this. And there are all of the organizations that are represented here at the IAF are taking this very seriously. In fact, I've been here since Wednesday, and I've probably had 30 or 40 meetings so far. And if I've had 40 meetings, in 39 of them we spoke about ESG. And so this was one of the most important topics that I talked about in every single meeting I had this week. And I think there's a momentum that's starting to grow. We definitely need to leverage the expertise and the knowledge of Europe because they're definitely ahead of the United States. But the United States is going to take the lead because the private sector is going to lead it.
So Michelle, I want to think a little bit about the insurance sector in particular, right? Because all these considerations play out differently in different industries. And you've got both sides of your balance sheet to think about in this context, asset and liabilities. So what considerations does this raise for you?
Yes, there is first, of course, we're investors. That's absolutely clear. We don't have all the freedom we don't have enormous freedom about the investment because of asset liability management, but definitively we are also quite active in impact investing. But there again, I do believe, we have a tendency in many of these things, everybody invents a championship in which you are the champion. Okay, apparently, in which you are the champion. So the taxonomy issue is something which is very important. I must say the key role of the insurance industry is probably more on the liability side. Mm-hmm. But beside asset and liability, I must also confess that we should be humble enough in the financial service industry to realize that the challenges are probably a little bit easier for us in the sense that we do not have manufacturers, we do not have plants, so it's easy to be green if you're an insurer. So let's also sometimes start with trying to show the way by giving example. You can promote public transportation for your employees wherever they are. You can try to use a little bit less plastic. It may be symbolic, but it gives you at least a certain weight when you speak with other industries about the way in which they should behave. Because let's be fair, we have in that respect a little bit an easier game as many other players. And then you have the role of the insurers when it comes to accelerating the transition for industries which are definitively challenged, in which we need also to recognize that an industry, oil, for example, has been extremely respected until a few years ago and starts to be challenged now. Not everything can change from a day to another. You need to go along with the transition, but you need to be very precise about what you expect also from the changes. And that is something that we are doing on underwriting. We may lose some of our clients. I must nevertheless say that I found a lot of people who are quite convinced about the necessity of change in industries which are probably not on the top of the green ranking or the green hit parade, if I may say. Also on individuals or on retail, supporting initiatives like electric cars, insuring people who are producing this type of cars is also something that the insurance can do. But on the liability side, I insist, one of the key elements for us is to be very clear about the support we give on the certain timeline and supporting this transition. But we can be probably much more effective on the liability side as insurer that we can be only on the investment side. Even if we belong to many of these so-called initiatives, which are probably extremely valuable, but I do believe that the taxonomy diversity that we have for the current time doesn't help us probably sometimes to calibrate each and every of these initiatives.
So, Johan, Michel says it's easy to be green, and here I can't help but think for any Americans in the room about Kermit the Frog and his song about it's not that easy being green, but perhaps it is. But how about from your perspective in business strategy, right? Factoring sustainability throughout business strategy. You've done a lot of work on sustainable infrastructure, green energy. Tell us about it.
No, I think it's becoming almost a parallel universe to be having a relationship with doing something that is sustainable. So if I look at our bank, we just put a new business plan together, and it's kind of in everything you do these days. There's no conflict about value creation and sustainability. Some people would like to put that as in a polarization. So I'll just mention a few examples. First, you have the product development. There is nothing going on as much as product development on sustainable financial services right now. I think demand is there. It's up to the bankers right now and the system to create the supply that can meet the demand. And it's really spreading through innovation and real imagination right now. So we've done bonds for vaccine, and the green bonds are old now, so we're trying to look at blue bonds to do it for clean water. And your imagination is your limitation. Then you look at asset management. It's probably the fastest growing area on demand side. It's for sustainable criteria for investment purposes. Is that and alternatives? But the traditional stuff is actually falling a bit. An actively managed classic equity fund, that is not going to be the future. There is a purpose being built in. Then you look at the loan book. I've done corporate lending for a long time, and there's one phrase, there's a chapter in the documentation called use of proceeds. And we all wrote in those for 20 years, general corporate purposes, 3 words. And then off you go, and that was all you had to elaborate. Today, we are finding the largest time consumed is on the purpose of this capital. And now when you do a green bond, there are pages and pages of them where you actually commit because people care. What am I going to do with it? Not only the financial return. So that's on green lending, bank lending. And then you have employees. Kes mentioned it. You cannot have a competitive advantage in hiring the best and the brightest unless you genuinely talk about these things, because it's become, and banking is, people are at the core of everything that we do. Without the best people, you won't produce the best results. So it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And Kes, a kind of a similar question from your perspective. You've done a lot of pioneering work in green loans and green mortgages and so greening the real estate sector. So how can banks help in this way?
No, I think the green bonds have been, that's a 10-year anniversary here celebrated in Washington last year. That's a good role model. But there is a retailification that we need to do now. So it's been very institutional. The big money, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars a year. So we are just trying out our ways in a small country like Sweden. So we launched green mortgages. That's energy classification for the house. Those are very expensive in Sweden. It's a cold country. But we do say that these assets are future-proof. My 4-year-old daughter might not want to buy anything but in 20 years. These very energy efficient houses. We're looking into the real juice that would be around green deposits. Can we actually start having bank accounts that are separated, where one has a purpose built into it, but then we need to create the green loan asset because there needs to be a follow through. So all these things are now happening in retail. We've just launched green car leasing. So companies who would like to go over to electrical cars, that we have these purpose-built financial services available.
And Kees, we had a wonderful workshop in Amsterdam all about kind of real estate sector environmental risks, and of course flooding was very high on the agenda there. And in fact, we met during Climate Week at the global launch of the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, or PCAF. So these are measurement tools for these risks. How is that evolving? And it's going global.
Yeah, well, indeed, that's a development we have stimulated actually with over 10 banks actually in the Netherlands, and we launched it 3 weeks ago with the responsible banking principles, which was also indeed that weekend. There were a lot of banks available. You were there. A lot of banks, also US banks, were all there. And it is indeed, as I mentioned before, the taxonomy and the calculation that you can really show what the effect of your measures is. And that can be indeed making houses more sustainable, which we also finance. And exactly to your point, my daughter bought a house recently. And the energy label A was for her a big thing to look at. And well, that was different in the past, I think. Investments are, investments these days, we at the moment, when a client comes to us in private banking, we have a green offering as a default. So you actually, for new clients, you have to ask for something else. And over 50% of the new clients do that. And then what you notice now more and more is that they then also want to have a kind of result of what do you do with the money? How does it help the world in a way? And there was, I would say, this initiative of accounting was done because we want to roll it out actually more in a worldwide framework. And yeah, it was launched there, you were there, and I think there was a lot of enthusiasm. We have also got a lot of questions later on, so let's hope that we can continue there.
Yeah, it highlights some of the huge problems around the lack of data and the lack of analytical tools. So, but Audrey, this brings me to you, and I think we have a number of questions from the audience addressed to you specifically, so I'll keep these in here too.
Okay.
What are the challenges of being a CSO? But I also wanted to come back to you on this sort of terminology and taxonomy questions. You know, you have sustainable investment, responsible investment, ethical investment. Does it matter, you know, what you call it, as rose by any other name? And how do investors know whether their money is really having an impact? And all these are tough questions.
Yeah. So, you know, on the one hand, I think it does matter because confusion can be created between these different terms. On the other hand, I'm sort of like, I don't really care what you call it as long as you're clear what you mean by it. And so what I think the important issue is that, you know, right now we have this sort of wonderful mix where there's philanthropists, there's development banks, and then there's, you know, sort of hardcore for-profit investors who are all in this space. And I think the first thing is it's just very, very clear that it's important that you understand, you know, what you're doing, right? And so if you're looking for a impact maximizing way to deploy funds, which may or may not be accurately called an investment, right? That maybe is a philanthropic or a development-focused activity, which is incredibly important and which can really help catalyze changes, you know, and eventually I think it comes over into helping seed and grow, as was discussed, more assets, more investment opportunities for investors. So we at Morgan Stanley, I mean, we've really focused on talking about sustainable investing because we think that if we want to get the maximum number of dollars aligned towards things that help strengthen the environment, protect the environment, strengthen communities, and create opportunity, it has to be what I call sort of capital S sustainable. It has to be financially sustainable, otherwise you're never going to do it a second time, as well as sort of environmentally and socially sustainable. So I think the terminology is, you know, what you call it is not important as long as you're clear what your expectations are for that. I think within the investment community and, you know, on the true sort of capital market side of things, it's very important that people understand sort of what they're expecting from a risk perspective, from a return perspective. And increasingly what we're seeing is, and this goes right to all of what we've been saying about disclosure and standards, is that there is definitely an increased desire from investors to understand impact. We recently did a poll of investors and we found that 85% of investors wanted to align their portfolios with their values. About 90% of millennials, and about 85% of investors also expected to have reporting on their impact. Not just on the financials. And interestingly, exactly, you know, as you were saying, the demand is ahead of asset management industry's ability to meet it, and so they're running like crazy. We did a survey also of international asset managers. 89% of the asset managers said that they were planning to spend more resources on developing sustainable investing in the next 1 to 2 years. You know, and that's really because we're seeing asset owners from whether it's the largest pensions in the world like GPIF in Japan to the millennial wanting to invest their first $5,000 in the markets, that all of them are really expecting a degree of sort of transparency and understanding for the financial returns as well as the impact returns.
So that actually brings me around back to Doug with the kind of credit implications of all of this. The credit rating agencies is a big part of growing sustainable investing. So how is this all, I mean, you've got the kind of tragedy of the horizon question, right? I mean, environmental, social, governance risks tend to be very long-term in nature. Credit ratings are focused more on the near term. How do you look at that?
Well, a couple of comments. Before I go to that, let me just mention that recently at our company, because we have a very broad spectrum of ESG products, we just recently did a carbon attribution analysis of GPIF's entire portfolio. And you can see it over at our booth if you want to go and see how we did that and what came out of that. But going to our ratings process, first of all, when you look at the traditional traditional credit ratings, they are through a cycle, 5 to 7 years, might be a little bit longer depending on how we're looking at it. But that might not be as long as a risk for climate risk or other ESG risk. However, we always incorporate what are the most important risks that could impact the ability or willingness of a counterparty to repay their loan in full. And as part of that analysis, we went back 2 years ago and we said, let's take 2015 and to 2017, all of the rating actions we took, apply a natural language processing approach to them, an analytical approach, and see how many of those ratings, even though we didn't call them ESG, had some sort of an ESG trigger for a downgrade. And on those, we found 15% of those downgrade actions or ratings actions had some sort of an ESG factor which led to that. Most of those were governance, fraud, or board problems, management problems. And then the others that were S were safety, mine safety. There were some issues at oil fields, things like that. And then on the environmental side, it was flooding, it was rising sea levels, it was fire, it was things like that. So with a hindsight view, we identified that we were already including ESG factors in our ratings if they are a significant risk for a company to repay their debt. So as part of that work, we're now incorporating those factors more explicitly into our ratings and calling them out. So if there is an ESG factor in a traditional credit rating which impacts the creditworthiness, we call it out in a report and report it like that. And we're going to be enhancing our ratings along that line. Now, simultaneously with that, the last few years, across S&P Global, in our index business, we've had long-term, we've been in the index, the sustainable index business through the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices and other products. But we took all of our different products across the company and all of the different initiatives and put together a design team and a data factory. And one of the products that we've just launched is called an ESG evaluation in the rating agency. We've set up a taxonomy for a risk atlas for geographic risk, for industry risk across 44 different industries, and then very specific factors for E, S, and G that we measure, that we track, and then we have meetings with the management. And what we found is the real value added of this approach is that we include, beyond an E, S, and G score, a preparedness score. So you could see two different companies, let's say in the oil industry, that one of them is still operating as if they're in the 1950s, and one of them is building investments to recapture all of their methane. They're investing in renewables. They've put in place a whole new supply chain on how they're managing the company. They have a plan for transition. They could get very different ESG evaluation scores because of their preparedness and the way they're approaching it. So this is a new area we've only had 3 of these. It's a pilot product, and we've just launched it also for the financial services industry. But we think that we need to start looking at this and be very forward-looking in the way we use our rating agency to be prepared to help with the ESG market.
And I think you've just addressed another question we had coming in about one of the biggest issues in scaling up green investment is data. And you highlighted some of the ways in which you're addressing.
Yeah, and on data, we really, as I mentioned earlier, so much of it is self-disclosed, and you need to go to the companies. And this is one of the frustrations of companies. I'm sure all of us up here, in some part of our, maybe investor relations or corporate secretary, they're filling out, I mentioned before, 36 potential different people approaching you to fill out a survey, and then you've got all those different magazines and industry reviews and others. So you could be inundated with people asking you for information. And so as we see a few organizations coming up with standardized data that are doing these surveys, and I know that the accounting industry is looking to see if they could help with that dialogue, but data is critical. You need the data to do this. But one of the ways, as I mentioned, we've done it is we're starting to gather all of the data in our company in one single data warehouse instead of trapped in the index business or the ratings business, et cetera. And we've found a lot of benefit from that for our own company.
Excellent. Well, I want to spend our last few minutes here taking a little bit more of a forward-looking view on where opportunities are. We talked a lot about risks. Let's talk a little bit more about opportunities, and then finishing up with some thoughts on taking a longer-term view. So, Kees, why don't I start with you here? Where do you see the growth opportunities ahead?
Well, I think a lot that has already been mentioned, but if I look at the energy sector, is a sector which we're also involved in, and we have decided that we are a big bank, so that you need to take the transformation and the transition periods also of companies into account. So, as an example, last year we had around 7% of renewables, today 15, next year 20. So that is our target range, improving. And then of course the other equivalent of the 80%, you want to look into that as well. Can you go from coal to oil to gas? So in all those areas, actually you're looking in all your, I would say your portfolios. How can you make things more sustainable, be it the mortgages, 150 billion for us, so serious business. Every conversation now with a new mortgage or an interest reset, there is a conversation with the people. We can give you 25K, you can make your house more sustainable, we can show you returns, we can even help you with providing the people who do it, so you don't get all kind of people you don't trust, but certified by the bank in a way. So that is what you do in all, I would say, in all the areas. And we really see it as a business model, but it is going, it is a transformation. We're also on palm oil as an example. We don't step out of all those business lines. We don't do that. We, of course, ask our clients to become a member of the sustainability, the roundtable, palm oil roundtable, sustainable roundtable. And of course, there are enough NGOs, we always say, around with that drones checking if people don't burn forest. And of course, you have to look into the conditions of, work conditions in those areas as well. But you cannot just quit it. So. And then, of course, there are also business models now becoming much more circular. I just read in the Financial Times today that now even Lego is trying to adapt actually the circular way of actually giving the Lego, but also getting it back some moment in time. We know it for design clothes, of course. IKEA was mentioned as a company which. Has a target now of giving furniture and what have you, and trying to get 70% in a kind of circular model. So these kind of things, we have a completely circular building next to our head office in Amsterdam. So just an example. Those are all examples. IAF was there over the summer.
Been in that building.
You were there. No, so it's just all, and you don't do it only for then the carbon dioxide, but it's also that you learn new approaches. When I go and I'm in Rotterdam with a guy building ships, he is light years ahead of our bank because he has to build the ships for 25 years. But what we learned from them, those large companies, we can transform to the smaller companies, and they don't have all that knowledge. And we are a transmission mechanism as a bank, as I see it, to do that.
Doug, you wanted to comment quickly, but then I want to go to Audrey on the same question.
Very briefly, one of the biggest topics we've talked about for many years here, and Michelle and I have been involved in different forms, is infrastructure. And I just want to give ourselves a challenge. It's not going to be easy, that this combination of financial markets, infrastructure, and sustainability are one of the ways we need to look at this from a policy point of view. There's massive amounts of private sector capital which would love to invest in infrastructure. It's long-term capital, it's in the insurance industry, the pension systems, endowments, et cetera. And infrastructure is a very natural home for that. But infrastructure needs to start being looked at with the ESG factors, with sustainable factors. And we need to find more ways to get private sector capital infrastructure. So I'd like to give ourselves a challenge that we really solve those three together, the financial capital, infrastructure, and sustainability together.
Yeah. Audrey, on opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things we're most excited about is that I think we're really seeing a convergence right now of the ability of, financial services players like ours to figure out how can we facilitate some of these powerful trends that need to happen. How does that come together with corporate strategy and ultimately also with individuals? And so I'll give you, one example that we've been working a ton on is that about 6 months ago at Morgan Stanley, we announced the Morgan Stanley Plastic Waste Resolution, where we committed that we would do our part to facilitate the avoidance, reduction, removal, prevention of 50 million tons of plastic waste hitting rivers, oceans, and landfills by 2030. And so many people said, why is a bank doing something about plastic waste? Because, other than whatever sodas your bankers drink, that's not really. And we said, you know what? there's all of us right here could stop using straws and stop using plastic bags and stop doing all those things that we're all like worrying about, and it wouldn't make a difference to the billions of tons of plastic waste that is sitting here. Right, 91% of all plastic that has ever been made since plastic was invented about 50, 60 years ago is sitting somewhere, disintegrating into our water system and our food system. And no one individual, one company, or one sector alone can address that. But as a bank, right, we work with the chemical companies, with the industrial design companies, with the consumer product companies, with individuals, with the municipalities, with the dumps, with the recyclers, and we can try to actually help bring this sense of how do we innovate, how do we reduce waste, how do we get to a better collective solution. And so we were really excited that just last week, actually, we worked with Pepsi to help them structure their first green bond, which again borrows from all the wonderful work that's been done in green bonds, but this was the first U.S. corporate to focus a big portion of their $1 billion green bond on plastic reduction. And so I think when you see this tie-in to what millennials want from brands, from their banks, from their personal products, it's a really powerful sign for the future. And again, since I've been the statistics person up here today, I'll just give you one last fun one, because we've all talked about millennials and employees. And again, what we've seen is that it's not just that millennials are young, and therefore they're sort of liberal and hopeful, and once they, pay bills, that it's going to be different, right? Millennials are already today the largest generation in at least the U.S. workforce, and I think that's global. They are 3 times more likely than other generations to choose their employer based on commitment to sustainability. They're twice as likely to scan every single product that they touch, wear, eat, or whatnot for sustainability, and they're twice as likely to buy an investment product if it has a sustainable strategy, and they're twice as likely to divest from a product or strategy or investment if it doesn't have a good sustainability mechanism. So I think that's a great clarion call to all of us, whether you're a corporation, a bank, or anyone, that increasingly we're seeing consumer demand and performance and risk reduction aligning around sustainability is just a prudent way to manage your business.
No, indeed. And on that note, Michelle, I'm going to give you the last word here on the G part, on the role of the board and governance and driving this agenda forward.
Well, I think, the roadshow that I make are definitively dedicated mainly to ESG, and the key element that the board can bring, beside the fact that the mix of the board is also giving a kind of window to the industry that we are covering, and we have also then the opportunity to exchange view about the challenges of the diverse industries. The key role of the board is to let investors understand that the long-term view is something which is massively important, and to, if I may say, free up a little bit the executive management for the short-term slavery. Not that I believe that being inefficient short-term is the best guarantee to be efficient long-term, but I believe that there is a role to be taken by the board to give to the executive management of a firm a certain comfort that the long-term targets are the important one. But it's also a role of the board to let understand to the investors, and to be honest, they understand that each time more, that it is an important aspect of the sustainability. Let's be fair, one of the key roles of the board is to make also the firm that we are sharing sustainable. And the best way to do that is definitively balancing the long term on the short term.
Well, that's a great note to end on. And please thank me. Please thank the panel. Join me in thanking the panel.